There's such a rich decoding our fantasies is such a rich tool for learning more about ourselves and bringing us into the present and maybe able to incorporate some of those learnings from ourselves, from our unconscious mind into real life.
I'm Cindy Darnell, and welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, cultural, political, and other lenses, and find some ways to explore some very diverse erotic quandaries. Today's guest is Dominic Davies, the founder and CEO of Pink Therapy, an organisation he set up in the UK 21 years ago. He's worked as a psychotherapist and clinical sexologist for almost 40 years. Yeah, 40 years, specialising in working with gender, sex and relationship diverse clients. He directs an international online training program as well. He's a fellow of both the National Council of Psychotherapists and the National Counselling Society, the highest recognition these bodies offer. However, he's most proud of being awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award for Sexual Freedom in 2018. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dominic Davies. Dominic Davies, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. I'm really glad that you accepted my invitation to be on the show.
Oh, Cindy, I'm honoured to be with you. And I was a little bit intimidated when I first got it because I thought, oh my goodness, I don't really see myself as a philosopher.
Oh.
But I'm sure we'll have a great chat because we always do have good conversations when we meet. So
Indeed.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. And I mean, it's interesting that you don't see yourself as a philosopher, because I remember when we first met in London, going back about 8 or so years, I was very impressed with the body of work that you've created. And so for people who are not familiar with you and the work that you do, how would you describe yourself and your work in your own words?
For the last almost 40 years, I've worked with LGBTQ people as a therapist and a sex therapist. For the last 21 years ago, I set up an organization called Pink Therapy, which works to help clients, queer people, find queer-friendly therapists, people who aren't going to judge them because of their different various identities, and that provides training for mental health practitioners, because, as you know, there's very little training that takes place in core programs. So at the beginning, and then that organization came off the back of editing 3 of the first 3 British textbooks on working with LGBT people. The first one came out in 96, and the second 2 volume came out in 2000. And then in 99, I set up the organization Pink Therapy when I came back from Australia, and where I was co-editing the last 2 of those volumes. Yeah.
And that's amazing to think that the first UK or English language text on specifically working with LGBT people only came out in the 90s. That when we think about the history of psychotherapy, and we think about the history, of humans on the planet, that it's really in very recent history that we've even started talking about the needs of LGBT people specifically. Why do you think it has been such a stigma? And how do you see the stigma now in contrast from the 90s?
Well, it was only in 92 that the World Health Organization declassified it. So the Americans did it a lot earlier. And all the materials and the research textbooks that I was reading to prepare the first book, I was drawing on American sources because there were no British ones at all. There was nothing European in English European that I could access. So the Americans were pioneering this. The stigma, I think, just grew out of the post-Freudians having left, in particular, the post-Freudians having left, escaping the Nazi persecution in Germany and in Austria. They went to London and New York and needed to assimilate. So while they were living very progressive, open-minded lives in those cities before the Second World War, as a result of fascism, they left for safety, and they had to assimilate into the dominant cultural norms of largely New York and London in those post-war years. And those countries were deeply homophobic. They didn't know anything about understanding anyone. So homosexuality was seen as a crime in those days. Lesbians weren't on the agenda at all. Trans people were barely ever mentioned. And in fact, it's only really been in the last 15 to 20 years that we've seen, 20 years that we've seen people treating trans people with some respect. And of course, there's a lot of tension in the media in this country, and I think probably elsewhere, where there's a lot of hostility to accepting trans women are women and trans men are men.
Yes.
And some of the media have been really kicking up a kind of hate campaign there. But if we take the hate campaign aside, I think there have been huge leaps in terms of the general public's understanding of, and a lot of people now know trans people and are supportive and interested in trans people. We've seen some great depictions on TV through things like Pose and an amazing program, Disclosures, on Netflix, that kind of did for trans people what the celluloid closet back in the probably 90s, 80s, did for LGBT people. Vito Russo's program, The Celluloid Closet, kind of unpicked gay representation in film. And Disclosures did that for trans people. And it's stunning how things have changed over the years, really.
Yeah. And I followed especially the backlash in Britain, particularly against recognition of trans men and women, which from a media point of view is not quite so strong as in my observations here in the US media. I mean, I'm curious, with your vast experience in the broader LGBT community, and now with this new umbrella term of queer and let's add in kinky as well, how have you seen the landscape change around erotic diversity in the years you've been working?
I think one of the significant changes is that for some people, back in my day, when I was in my youth, then identity was a big deal. Claiming the identity as being other than heterosexual was a big deal. Coming out, as we called it. That's become less of an issue in many ways for young people nowadays. And there's less energy or desire to nail one's colours to the flagpole and say, this is who I am. I'm lesbian, I'm gay, I'm bisexual. There's a lot more of a fluidity around gender expression and around sexuality and affectional expression. And we're getting to see more, things like asexuality. Before, when you and I were training as sex therapists, it was hypoactive sexual desire disorder or inhibited sexual desire. And it was pathologized. And whilst there might still be people who have something that needs treating, a lot of those patients would probably now be self-identifying as asexual and not wanting to be fixed with their desire disorder, because they don't see themselves as disordered. They just see themselves as living in a society that expects them to be sexual. And likewise with kink and BDSM, there's been a kind of softening of the boundaries and people being willing, I think, through work of people like yourself, that shows that sex is about pleasure. It's about power. It's dangerous, but it's dangerous because it's good.
Yeah, and that's part of the appeal for people.
And that's why we like it. I remember reading Esther Perel around mating in captivity and the kind of things we want in our lovers being really at variance to those that we want in our partners in terms of qualities and the like. I think now people are more open to admitting they're kinky, at least in their fantasies. I did a talk the other day and looked at some research that said like between 2.5% and 70% of us have had kinky behaviors or kinky fantasies.
Right. Wow. 2.5% to 70%. That's a huge...
To 70%.
Yeah. Slice.
So knowing that, we should assume that all of our clients pretty much are going to have kink fantasies, even if they haven't yet had the opportunity to act upon them. And we need to be trained in order to be able to talk about that with them and explore that with them. That's been one of the hugest gaps. I mean, I think general sex and sexuality is a big gap in talk therapies training, unless they train as sexology. And then in sexology, there are flaws because of what they do talk about and what they don't talk about there. There are huge limits. But things outside of heteronormativity, cisgender heteronormativity, are just not covered.
Yeah.
And there's a huge need for therapists to want to know about that stuff because the clients are coming in presenting with it.
Right. And so something that I think is really, I mean, you've done a lot of extraordinary things, in my opinion, but one of the things that I really love that you are a very strong advocate for is this notion of GSRD that you have, and it was you and Meg John Barker, right?
Absolutely,
who created this phrase GSRD. For people listening who don't know what I'm talking about,
sure.
Can you talk us through where that came from and why it mattered?
Okay. We found that there were lots of letters being added onto LGBTIQ, QA, 2As or 2T. And like it just became, would we keep adding letters? And when you look at what those letters were covering, they still left out things like, they often left out asexuality and BDSM and kink. And so we wanted to try and find a term that was more embracing of all of those identities that therapists could use. Not necessarily, I don't go up to strangers and come out as GSRD. I might come out as queer, or I might come out as kinky. I still might have these other identities. But when we're thinking about what are the similarities and what are the differences between all of these different identities, we thought gender, sex, and relationship diversity meant it could include pretty much everybody. It's not a minority. These are diversities, because when you look at the research about all of the different populations and activities, it covers pretty much all of us. There are the swans, who I refer to as the swans, people who are cisgender, heterosexually married and mate for life with only ever have one sexual partner.
Right.
They can be the swans. But the rest of us, and that is like a very, very large proportion, the majority of people, are not swans.
Yeah.
And so we need to kind of look at what do we have in common and what's different.
Yes. And I think this is such a huge shift in sex therapy, sexology, sex counseling, sex coaching, the whole umbrella that we talk about on The Erotic Philosopher. It's the whole shebang. And also for lay people who are listening, people who are not necessarily clinicians who want to hear about this stuff, to help them understand sexuality more, that where we started once upon a time with the distinction of LGBT, which is valuable, still remains valuable. What we're also understanding is that sexual and relationship diversity, to use this phrase, and gender really does exist on a spectrum. It changes through our lives. And the concept, certainly I think, of heterosexuality. I mean, I think heterosexuality is a thing, but it's a thing that's so vague, and there's the swans, as you were talking about, but because so many, even straight people, don't fit into that, and that learning to see themselves through multiple lenses, and that now it's starting to flip into the alternative sexual communities, that people are perhaps not as straight as they thought they were, or perhaps even not as gay as they thought they were. Are you seeing a bit more of that especially I'm thinking more of traditional gay men's and lesbian communities that would be very much, no, this is all I'm into, that there's a bit more openness and acceptance from those communities also?
I think those communities have always been fairly diverse, although there might be political tensions that go on between whether it's cool for a lesbian to be involved in BDSM, for example, and those tensions and discussions that happened in kind of political spheres in the 80s. There's stuff around that. But if you take the heterosexual, bless them, and they want to they have a problem with kink, or they're polyamorous and they want to go and explore that in therapy, where do they go for that? Because they can't go to the LGBT organizations, because quite rightly, they've got money to work with their communities, and it's LGBT people usually delivering services to other LGBT people. So where does the kinky, straight, or polyamorous person go? Do they go to marriage counselling, or Relate, as it's called in the UK? And if they go there, then what if they want to bring a third or fourth partner into the session? Couples counselling is what it's often now, or was called. Relationship counselling was called couples counselling. And you're told, no, you can only bring your partner here. We're here to help the family stay together. So where do they go for relationship help?
Right.
If you say that you want to beat your partner, or you like being beaten by your partner consensually, then that's domestic violence, and they're not allowed to be treated because that's an active abuse. So it goes on. So you can't actually get help in the public sector very easily, which is why our kind of directory, people have to go into the private sector for that. And it shouldn't be that way. We should really have everybody trained in the public and the private sector to work with all of these issues.
And so that's where your founding of Pink Therapy as a directory, but also as a training organization, has come into it, because you recognize this gap in the knowledge of therapists in training, whether they're doctors, psychologists, social workers, counselors, coaches, the whole spectrum of helping professions, let's say, who need to get this information about really the truth about human sexual diversity and human relationship diversity, that it's just not this cut and dried model of you're this or you're that, and then you're this or you're that for life. It's way more textured and complicated.
Sure. So we need them to know about the kind of be culturally safe or culturally fluent in working with whichever of these communities the client is coming from. And then they need to understand some of the kind of core psychological processes that people within these communities might be manifesting or experiencing. And there's some overarching theories like, minority stress, which most people will have heard about nowadays, which says because you live as a minority, you're likely to experience more depression, more anxiety. You'll maybe have a tendency towards self-harm and suicidal ideation because of the isolation that you feel, because of the way society shames you. That may well be an issue. And that's going to affect everybody who is in some way unusual or queer. That's the diversity of it. And so we kind of have to look at some of these things about how we help therapists work with those issues. But the cultural safety is crucial, and each of these are different identities, and intersections of these are going to have different issues. And so we need to learn what are the norms within those communities.
And you've also championed through Pink Therapy as well, in addition to the GSRD work and training, championing the rights of sex workers also as a distinct community unto themselves who require particular care and particular sensitivities, maybe not seeking sex therapy necessarily, but perhaps just seeking mental health counselling.
Just needing a safe space to come and work on whatever issues are affecting them in their work without judgment, without someone trying to persuade them that they shouldn't be doing it, or that they need to find the Lord or find a better way of living.
That's really moving the therapeutic process, I think, kicking and screaming a bit into the 21st century, into recognizing that sex as we conceptualize it through the older models from the 60s and 70s when sexology landed on the map, that as much as that was radical and wild at the time, it was just the beginning, and we're only still just at the beginning somewhat. Dominic, on The Erotic Philosopher, we often have people write in with their own sex and diversity questions. Would it be okay if I read one of these letters to you for you and I to ponder?
Oh, wow, that would be fab. Yes, I'd love that.
All right, Dominic, are you ready?
Go for it.
Okay. Dear Philosopher, I'm a 38-year-old man married to a lovely woman. We have 2 small children under 6. I'm professionally accomplished and content with my career prospects. From the outside, everything's like a postcard, but from the inside out, our relationship is barely holding on. The problem is that I'm deeply kinky and I long to be dominated by men. I haven't always been this. I've been with my wife for 10 years, and while kink has always appealed to me, it never did to her, and I considered myself straight. Now the kink is really surfacing, and with a new twist to be dominated by men. I've read a lot, and I've read that gender and sexuality were fluid, but I'd never experienced that until now. This is a problem because not only are my wife and I not sexually connected, but I can't get into it with her at all. She asks me and I tell her that nothing's wrong, that I'm just preoccupied with work. But I can't keep lying like this, and I feel so ashamed. I have a therapist, but I don't even dare tell them. I feel really stuck, and this festering is making it worse. Anything you have from one of the philosophers will be helpful. And that's from Robert.
Okay.
What do you think? This is quite perhaps not such a modern conundrum, but the fact that Robert will even talk about this is...
It's great that he's wanting to get some help, because... And it's such a pity that he doesn't feel safe to talk about it in his therapy. But I really trust people's intuition with this kind of stuff, when so many therapists, so somebody did some research that showed 1/3 of therapists would try and talk people out of their kink desires or cure them of it.
Wow, 1/3.
Then it's like, okay, well done, Robert, for recognizing that isn't a good place to go. And maybe coming here is a better space to try and look at this. But there's a lot of, that shame is one of those constant things that runs through so much sexually. But he's got a discrepant desire, as we would think about it. He's into one thing and his partner's into another. And that's a really normal situation in probably every long-term relationship, we go through these differences in desire where one of us likes this and the other doesn't like that. And so that's a problem for the couple that might benefit from being talked about. But he also talked about this change in his desires. He talked about being deeply kinky. I wonder what that means. I'm curious about what is deeply kinky. And that it sounds like the desire for being dominated by men was a new thing for him.
Yes, that's the impression that I got, that it hadn't been there before.
So I wonder what's changed now for that desire to emerge. Often straight people will be kinky with other straight people. So he might want to go and see, he might have seen a dominatrix or a dominant woman. If his wife doesn't want to do it with him, and I think it's really very hard to turn a vanilla relationship into a power-based relationship. It's super hard to do that. To beat the one you love or to treat it seriously and with respect. And to force that upon someone else is not, is not going to be acceptable. So I don't think it would be right for him to try and persuade his wife to be kinky when she's not. But I think there's a great book by Dossie Easton on when someone you love is kinky, which helps vanilla people understand, maybe in his case, his wife, understand why this is a relevant and important desire and a need that might need to be fulfilled so that they could then look at how he's going to get those particular needs met.
I mean, it sounds like no matter what path he takes, I mean, I guess he can keeping it to himself, but he's saying that it's untenable for him. He can't, he cannot continue like that. So at some point, either he's going to have to discuss this with his wife or, I mean, if he goes and pursues this outside of the relationship, non-consensually or non-disclosed, which many people would call cheating. But I mean, I know that that's a thing and people do that because, it is a mechanism that people can use to help themselves soothe, especially if they are in relationships with people who are just not going to get it or not willing to get it. That said, he hasn't talked to her about it, so he hasn't even given her a chance.
And that kind of acting outside of those rules can help maintain the family home, maintain the unit for the kids and for the wife and keep things looking okay, if it is okay. But it sounds like there's something a bit rotten at the core. There's a worm inside the apple that is eating away at the apple, and that does need attending to, I think, for sure.
This can occur in so many different kinds of relationship structures. I think that as we grow and evolve, if we didn't set a precedent at the beginning of the relationship for truths to be out in all kinds of relationship structures, even if you started off being, poly and kinky and queer.
Oh, for sure.
That even still in these relationships, things will change and that we will want to say, I would like for this to happen, or I'm feeling like this. That if there's no room in any given relationship to express fluid truths that emerge that were not there at the beginning, but they come through, 1, 2, 3 years later. This is where I think we start getting into life skills and relationship skills. How do we talk about the complexities of being in partnership and the fact that sex and relationship dynamics do change?
I think we need to have a lot more preparation for relationship skills and communication skills when we're at school. There's a lot of emphasis on we need good sex education, but we also need really good relationship education too, I think. And parenting skills and all of this stuff. Perhaps more than we need algebra.
Yes, I think so. And so for Robert, who may or may not be ever hearing this, and people who find themselves in Robert's situation, certainly not a situation of something being wrong with Robert at all, in fact, but there is certainly something in his relationship that he needs to address, and this is with his partner as well. And for people listening who are of any gender and any relationship style and any orientation, that feeling out of sorts in your relationship style is normal, and it does require attention because to leave it, as you say, if there's something rotten on the inside, it needs to be addressed.
Yes, I mean, it sounds like that they're not sexually connected anymore. They're not. So it feels like that isn't happening within the relationship. And I don't know if that's because his desire for kink has taken over, that he can't relate sexually to her in a pleasure-based, focused way, which is intimate and sharing, until he's got his other needs met. And it might be that if he gets some of those other needs met, of being dominated, that he can come back in and reconnect with her in the way that they had previously. I mean, I'm curious why men? Why is it preferable, or does now a sudden desire for men to come on the scene, to be dominated by men? And what's that about? What kind of domination by men? What does he see himself doing?
There's a lot of layers there.
What does he see himself doing, or how serving these men? What's his fantasy about? And I would really want to work with Robert on his erotic template, on his erotic pattern. What does he fantasize about in these situations, and try to understand the story there, really.
What it is that men either symbolize actually or symbolically, and what it is that he's looking to feel in the presence of men, perhaps.
I mean, Jack Morin's work on the erotic template, really arousal template, what's going on here in all of our fantasies? There's such a rich decoding our fantasies. It's such a rich tool for learning more about ourselves and bringing us into the present, and may be able to incorporate some of those learnings from ourselves, from our unconscious mind, into real life.
And so, I mean, even looking at as a situation as complex as this, and that Robert says he wouldn't dare mention this to his therapist, and Pink Therapy offer training to clinicians around being able to manage these diverse and very, very textured discussions. What are some of the programs that you offer that fill the gap for clinicians who perhaps would be thinking, wow, maybe some of my clients have these stories in their lives, but they don't ever tell me about them because they don't feel safe enough, or there's something that I'm doing in my practice as a clinician that doesn't necessarily set the stage for a client to feel comfortable to bring this up with me. How does the Pink Therapy training that you offer bridge those gaps for clinicians?
Well, I guess we've got two major offerings, really. One is for people who are really committed to becoming somewhat of a specialist in this field. So those people, 90% of the people who take those courses with us are going to identify as queer in some form themselves. They're either kinky or they're lesbian or trans or gay or whatever. So we've got a 1-year program which involves clinical supervision and lots of theory modules and essays and assignments and stuff like that. It's quite a commitment, but it really pays off, because they then develop a support network as well, because they're working with presenting their work to other colleagues. So, and most of these people are working in isolation in their own countries. We have people from all over the world doing these courses. So there's that program. And then there's the same theory modules are also available just to individual therapists who might say, actually, I think I need to know a little bit more about chemsex, or I want to know a little bit more about coming out issues or gender identity. And so they can be self-studied. I mean, we have a great one by Doug Braun-Harvey, who you and I both love to bits, on treating out of control sexual behavior as a kind of alternative paradigm to sex addiction. And certainly there's lots of people who are looking for other ways of thinking and working with people who present feeling out of control about their sexual behavior. And they can study, they can watch the videos and read some material and get ASECT credits for that particular module. So these are all on the training website, which is pinktherapy.org. And it would be lovely to hear from people if they were looking for things there.
And I think it's really important that not only that people know that these programs exist, so, because that's part of it, obviously, but more than anything, that people listening, whether you are a person who's wanting to explore sexuality for yourself, or you are a clinician wanting to upskill and to really understand that these sex problems they're problems in that they cause us distress, but they're actually really common and normal parts of the human condition, of human relationship, and that finding people to talk to, whether they are professionals or even just among your friends, among peers. Not everybody can or wants to be able to access traditional therapies, but finding communities, finding online communities to talk about this stuff. And that Robert, seemingly straight man from the outside, on the inner world, our worlds are very, very textured and complex, and that is what's normal.
That's very normal.
That's normal sex.
that's normal.
So Dominic, thank you for joining the Erotic Philosopher today. I really, really appreciate that. I'm going to put links to you and your work and your organizations, the things we talked about, in the show notes. And I would love to have you as a guest again sometime in the future.
Thanks, Cindy. It's been lovely having a conversation with you. Thank you.
I love being able to speak with people who have seen and been part of the evolution of sexual cultures and therapy in sexology over the last decade, and Dominic's work is uniquely positioned as being a real pioneer in this work, having seen changes over the last 40 years. Check out the links in the show notes about training with Pink Therapy if you would like to extend your knowledge of working with gender, sex and relationship diverse clients. And, of course, if you're enjoying the Erotic Philosopher, please go ahead and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. To work with me individually or as part of a couple or a group, head on over to cindydarnell.com. That's CYNDIDARNELL.com. You'll find out about ways to work with me, including my online pleasure school with ready-to-go courses for you to take at home. You'll also see the link to the Erotic Philosopher podcast there. Select the podcast tab and you'll catch up on all the previous episodes of the Erotic Philosopher, as well as finding the link to leave your own erotic quandary for the philosophers to ponder. And you can follow us on social media at The Erotic Philos, that's PHILOS. We're on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for listening.